Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Christina Hoff-Summers.
And I'm Danielle Crittenden, and we welcome Beth Crimmy into the studio today to fill in for Ella, who's away. I didn't believe we gave holidays on the Femsplainers. This millennial slacking off again.
Slacker millennial.
Gen Zers.
Had to have a mental health day.
Yeah, or manicure or something. But it's about to get started, Christina, and you go and you spill champagne.
I opened
all
the bottle
over the studio.
because no one gave me a towel. I was just told to open it. I opened it perfectly, but then poof.
Yeah, well, it smells now like, what, a French brothel in here.
It's true.
And I'm not drinking. There's like, by the time this airs, there will be one more week of sober October.
Is there anything more tiresome than sobriety?
Yes, a sobriety evangelical, and that's what I've become. You notice I have had an effect on you. You have to admit it that you're drinking a little less.
I am.
My husband's drinking less. Some of my friends are drinking less. They're inspired. You know why? Because I look so amazing. and I now have proof because one of my first topics of the week to just inspire you guys who are joining me to get through that last clubhouse turn of Sober October is that alcohol, Femsplainers, can ruin your looks.
It's a key offender.
It's expert reveals
aging your skin.
The telltale signs of wine face.
Dehydration.
Resting wine face.
Ooh.
You have resting champagne face right now, including fine lines, dry patches, and dullness. And do you know why? Well, you said dehydration.
Yeah, dehydration and...
It says the dehydration affects the production of natural collagen, while the sugar from wine can affect blood sugar levels and start a process called glycation, which damages the skin in the form of fine lines and wrinkles.
It's not as bad as smoking. Or the sun.
At least smoking keeps you thin.
True. And sun gives you, a nice suntan. But imagine if you smoke, drink, and live in Arizona. You're going to look lizardy.
You're going to look like a desert, an old alligator purse is what you're going to look like. So I just want to inspire you all. And I do notice that aside from sleeping better, my skin does look better, and I don't have that huge red alcoholic nose that I used to have. Did you notice that?
Yeah, it's gone.
And what do they call rheumy eyes, the red watery eyes, and the trembling hand, Christina?
But I have a conflict, and we will have to we have such informed listeners, maybe they can advise me on this, but I've had this chronic shoulder pain, upper back pain, and yesterday I had, I went to this doctor and it's called an EMG, an electromyo.
Is that where they poke you with needles or something?
They poke you with needles and then they measure muscle response or electrical activity in response to the nerve stimulation of the muscle, something like that. They
tried it around your liver and there was no response.
No, my liver is fine. No, they just see. And he said that it looked fine, but I still have this chronic pain. And I said, well, what do I do? And he said, exercise. I said, well, I do find if I drink wine in the evening, it takes away. He said, that's good. And I said, you mean I have your permission to drink 2 glasses of wine every night? And he said, absolutely.
That's until your liver starts looking fat. And we have to fat shame your liver. Well, my doctor has said no such thing, and I can't claim shoulder pain. But anyway, bravo to all of you who have sustained this Sober October with me.
And
we're going the distance.
Endured it with me.
Maybe we can toast the end of it when we're in Nashville this coming weekend.
You're not going to drink it? I'm not. No, I'm being bad. I have to be supportive. I have to be.
You've been very supportive. To be fair, you've not told me how much you're enjoying what you're drinking when you drink in front of me. I mean, you've kept it to a minimum. But Politicon this weekend. I'm sure you can still, I'm sure you can still get tickets. And Christina, what came across your interest this week? What caught your interest this week?
Well, so it's always what caused me the most irritation. And this is a story in the New York Times about the sexist undertones of wedding marketing. And they find it remarkable that many brides, but not grooms, are very attentive to marketing their weddings. Well, of course, weddings are just much more interesting to women, and women on average. I know that there are some exceptions out there, but it is something that...
What the New York Times was complaining that women were more interested in bride magazines or something than bridal sites?
Yes. Why don't they? Well, the focus was actually that there's this market. It does sound sort of absurd, where you can... there are websites where you can ask for can generate a hashtag for your wedding, and they say that these are sexist. They'll say things like, Smith is joining Doe. I don't know, making it as if I don't know why that it would be sexist. The whole thing is absurd.
Oh, I see, because it says that when you form the hashtag, it's all about changing your name to
his name,
and we're talking about
Hoff becomes Summers.
Yeah, we're talking about heterosexual weddings. Let's just be clear. But then it goes on to note that it says this, the New York Times survey 2015 found that 20% of married women had kept their last names. That's like. Okay, that's 1/5. The other 80%
aren't doing it and would appreciate those hashtags.
Are a little oriented around that. But wouldn't you also worry if your groom were more into the flower arrangements and table settings than you were? Would that cause you pause?
I'd be concerned, bordering on mortified. Because it's just, the wedding is typically something that women, heterosexual women, focus on. And the only people who focus on them more are gay males. Those have been some of the most beautiful weddings I have ever seen.
Well, I don't think the New York Times...
and they ignore gay.
Would they gay shame if gay men were getting too obsessed with their wedding planning?
No.
But I love how the New York Times, I don't even know what was the impetus for this article. It comes out of nowhere. It's like a writer decides, they take something that is very female, and then they decide it's sexist.
And pathologize
it. So the fact that women look at and enjoy wedding planning and wedding-related, porn, as it were, more than men is a problem. Did
you see this line? They say these bridal accounts are focusing more on what a woman is supposed to look like rather than on the emotions of the day. Well, aren't your emotions of the day slightly determined by what you look like? If you look and you want to look beautiful,
superficial. No, but it's also like, okay, they're talking about companies that market to brides.
Yeah, so stay away from those companies.
Emotions of the day. No, that's like your emotions of the day are from if you're having a religious ceremony. Yeah. It's about the ceremony. Right. It's about who you're having, how you're celebrating it. But the people who make headpieces are not really interested in your emotion of the day, except, as you say, will this headpiece make me feel happy?
Well, what were your emotions in the day of your wedding?
Oh, I don't know that my wedding is a good example. I got married in 1989. 88. What am I saying?
That's after anybody married after Lady Di. It changed the whole wedding. I mean, mine was before.
You kind of probably had a
hippie wedding. I think it was 81. Yeah. And it was an Orthodox Jewish wedding, but the party was at our house. Yeah. And it was, I think I made my wedding dress. I think I was, graduate student chic dress. And
you made it?
Well, I didn't exactly make it, but I sort of put it together. I think I looked a little like a shepherdess, a modern day shepherd, sort of flowers. It was a long time ago.
Did you have flowers in your hair? Did you look like a real hippie?
Yeah, it was a hippie wedding. And it was just fun. And we there was no concept of the wedding industry. Weddings were out of style. And then Lady Di had her Laura Ashley wedding. Yeah. And after that...
No, it wasn't. It was the designers who made her wedding cake confection. Wedding cake, remember the dress? It's the British designers, and the name has just slipped out of my head. It'll come back to me. But, but even then, even by 1988, there was still first of all, a lot of young women were not getting married.
Right.
And certainly young. So I was a total freak amongst my peers. And I mean, I've told you that our families weren't really getting along that well. Our mutual future in-laws were not. It was sort of Hatfield
Feuding
and McCoy situation, and I was just I just found the whole thing. I mean, I was very happy to be getting married to my husband, but I found the whole thing stressful. Yeah, there was no. I mean, I would have been grateful for this industry, honestly, and sites like The Knot, because we just felt that we had no idea what we were doing, and then the tensions were running high, which I guess, is probably true of a lot of weddings anyway. Everybody's tensions, escalate. And then there were sort of feministy things, like I didn't wear a veil because I thought that would be wrong. And it was just, we then had a second Jewish wedding because I converted 3 years later. And that was like you describe. It was done in our house, in our apartment in New York. And it was wonderful. I cooked. We had not 3 months later, 3 years later, because Miranda was just born. She began screaming and howling in the middle of it. She was like 3 months old. And then we ended up singing Fiddler on the Roof. It was so much fun.
In my wedding, my late husband was a philosopher, as you know, and a lot of philosophers came to the wedding. And among them was Willard Van Orman Quine, one of the most brilliant philosophers in the world. And somehow he ended up in the car from the shul to our house. He ended up with my Orthodox Jewish sister-in-law from Borough Park, very Orthodox. And she had no idea who he was, but she's very funny. She said, "So tell me," she said, "what do you do?" A friend of mine was in the car and told me this. And he said, "Oh, I'm a philosopher." "Where?" And he said, "At Harvard." "Ah, philosopher at Harvard. Very good." And that was just a mix of our hippie friends, my Orthodox relatives. We danced. We had a klezmer band, and then we had a rock band, it was just a crazy mix of people. People loved it. There were. It was.
Well, but it's also probably true that the less planning. I mean, you want things to go right. But the less, the New York Times, and this is just such an old, boring point, it would be better to pay less attention to things like the dress and spending your deposit for a future house on your dress and wedding alone.
They should be homemade. You should have it at home or in someone's backyard or garden, and then just make the food.
But this is nutty. But the idea that women are going to become less interested in
that is not going to happen. New York Times, and they are interested. 80% want to take their husbands' names, and they do care about the romance and the making it charming and romantic and fairy tale like.
Well, okay, so I think we've solved that one.
Yes.
What was? I have one.
Okay.
Speaking of millennials and Gen Zers, and Ella not being here today, so we can talk about her behind her back. Beth, don't say anything. And actually, you're part of this generation. Beth, how old are you?
I'm 23.
Oh, okay. So she's
23.
I know, that's so young. Okay, so Beth, it looks like 75% of your generation have quit their jobs because your mental health was suffering. 50% of millennials versus 10% of baby boomers.
I don't believe that statistic for a minute.
It's from the Daily Mail. It has to be true.
No,
actually, it's from Harvard.
Harvard. It's from a think tank or something that Harvard quoted. And I looked at their definitions.
Oh, right. Published in the
And
Harvard.
You were called mentally disturbed they would ask questions like, have you had periods where you were sad? I'm telling you, they have pathologized the human condition. And so if you go through a period where you're blue or you have anxiety, we're anxious because we're mortal beings and you have ups and downs. And now everything's given a label and they've just...
Well, it said millennials were 3 times more likely to experience anxiety, and Gen Zers were 4 times more likely compared to baby boomers. Beth, are you anxious right now? Are you okay? Are you okay? Hang on, can we just pause for a second? Beth, are you okay?
Little mental health intervention for Beth.
I think I'm doing okay.
Are you all right? I mean, Beth, you're not used to doing this with two crazy older women, so I just want to make sure, checking it. So Kelly Greenwood, CEO and founder of Mindshare Partners. I don't even know what that is.
Oh, I think they did the study.
Maybe. Okay. Findings represented a culture change between older and younger generations. And she said the first is self-awareness of mental health conditions. And part of it, too, is millennials and Gen Zers realizing they have options and that they don't need to stick around somewhere that will be detrimental to their health. I mean, that's kind of healthy, actually. This sense, I mean, obviously the economy has changed. The types of jobs you have changed. You don't sort of go into the Xerox Corp for life and
thank God
stay there. So, and it's, this is all very nice when we're in a good economy and other jobs are easier to get. But I think there is more awareness that sense. Beth, am I right that your job should be, I mean, if you have the luxury of having a fulfilling job, it should be fulfilling? Is that?
Yeah, I think that's where we're moving, sort of the idea that you don't just take a job because you need a job, take something that you're actually interested in.
Is it also why these companies catering to your generation have, like, toys in the office? Like they now look like big nurseries for adults with bouncy balls and
toys, food, coffee,
video games, beer. This study also noted that race was a big factor, too. It said results showed that nearly 50% of Black and Hispanic patients had left a job for mental health reasons. So,
well, I do question how they define these terms because I just think I wrote a book with Sally Sawtelle, One Nation Under Therapy.
That's true. You did. I sometimes forget you wrote that book.
Yep.
No offense.
Here we are.
Yeah.
It was 10 years, 15, 12 years ahead of its time. Well, 10 years ahead of its time.
But don't you also feel that this generation and us in general are more aware of mental health issues, that they're not things to be
No, I
ashamed
do
of
think
and things
there's
to hide?
just a more sophisticated understanding. At the same time, there's a tendency to treat normal human woes as, an illness in need of a cure, when in fact, most of this will pass. You will have periods of sadness. You'll have periods of anxiety. You will have periods, that's the human condition. And I think we've now taken it and turned it into a medical condition, and that everything in life is, if you're suffering grief or you had a trauma, yeah, you will be upset for a while. You lose your job. You will be very distressed. But not everything is going to lead to PTSD. There's also post-traumatic growth, which is more often what happens.
PTG.
Yeah.
Well, I also wonder whether because of the greater pharmacological awareness of treating these mental health issues, including even mild depression and anxiety, let alone more severe, that you get into a reliance that these things should be able to be fixed. That if I'm feeling sad and anxious, I can fix
medicine.
this. There must be some medicine. Or, recreational drug use, the rise of sort of edibles and let alone the larger addictions. That can this be feeding into our awareness of anxiety and then, as you suggest, not being able to just get through these harder, stressful periods? I mean, it's very easy to say, the younger generation is coddled
I don't like to do that,
helicoptered, and
I still think unless you have, you are clinically depressed, clinically anxious, which is a small percentage of people. For the majority of people, there are other ways to address these things. Exercise and having a dog. That turns out to be an important,
that was our next story.
Yeah.
It says, want to live longer, try getting a dog. This was in the Washington Post.
You get a cat, it lowers your life expectancy.
That's true. That's actually true.
But not dogs.
Dog owners live longer and are happier. Petting a dog lowers a person's blood pressure. It says, this was a study published in Circulation. That's a good name for the Journal of the American Heart Association. Yeah. I guess in the column mark, the beat. It says it reviews several decades worth of evidence on the relationship between dog ownership and mortality. And after reviewing 10 studies that included data on 3.8 million participants, the authors determined that, quote, dog ownership was associated with a 24% risk reduction for all-cause mortality as compared to non-ownership.
And they've ruled out, some people will say, oh, well, that's only because wealthier people have dogs or upper middle class people have dogs. They controlled for those variables and found that having a dog makes you happy. And that's why I'm getting a second dog. I'm looking for
You mentioned this.
A miniature red poodle.
Sure? Are we sure about the second dog?
Do you think I'm making a mistake?
I don't know. It does.
2 glasses of wine and a dog, and I'm going to be happy.
Except you'll get more wrinkles. I was going to say.
You don't care as much.
That's true. I was going to say, don't drink.
The dog, a dog doesn't care. See, that's the thing. A dog's love is unconditional. They don't notice the wrinkles. At least I don't think they do. Maybe they do.
They also, and if you've had heart problems, like it's even better for you after you've had a stroke or heart problems that the dog really helps you heal. Yeah, and the 2018 General Social Survey found that dog owners are happier than cat owners.
Well, as if anybody ever questioned that.
Why is that, Christina?
I don't know. Cat owners, I'm sorry, but it's true.
It's a slippery slope from owning a cat to owning a ferret.
Oh, God. My niece got a guinea pig.
Oh, guinea pigs, I've never understood the point.
It was like having a little rat.
And they smell.
They were frightening. And They had them, and then they had a Ferris wheel, and it got more and more elaborate, and then she got bored with them. Then they sold it. But the whole thing was...
How do you sell a used guinea pig?
Maybe it wasn't... What do they get? They get guinea pigs and...
Gerbils.
There's another thing.
Hamsters.
Maybe it was a hamster. No, it was a guinea pig.
Guinea pigs are huge. And
huge and frightening.
And, yeah, smelly.
The cage was filthy. No one wanted to clean it.
Yeah. Okay, and then they don't help you with your cardiovascular recovery, I don't think. But
just get a miniature red poodle.
Okay, well, did you have anything else before we go to our guest?
I do, but I don't even have time. I'll do this more next time. But Melinda Gates has... her foundation is now going to give $1 billion to be spent over the next 10 years to advance gender equity in the United States. Okay? At first I thought, okay, she's going to, join like human rights organizations and help with efforts in Saudi Arabia, Iran. No, it's in the United States. What is she going to do? $1 billion? She's going to support existing organizations that do not have a good record. The women's groups do not have a good record of promoting responsible research. They tend to be captive to this women are victims narrative. So there's going to be, I suspect, $1 billion supporting the women are as victims narrative. I don't know if we can survive this, $1 billion.
Well, it says, she wrote an article in Time magazine announcing that she's making this pledge. And it said she described that her sense of urgency was motivated by the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index, which found that at the current rate of change, the gender inequality gap will not close in the U.S. for another 208 years. I love the specificity of that, like 208. Like what will happen as opposed to 207 years?
Just think about that. So Melinda Gates.
Yeah.
All right. So first of all, she is using a fortune that was made by her husband. Fine.
Ooh, burn.
Well, I know, but I'm just want to be realistic. She married the boss. He asked her out for a date, like in the parking lot. Wouldn't that be, by today's definition, where there's zero tolerance for this kind of thing, that would be harassment. So she's going to be funding policies that would probably be punitive towards the way she met her husband. And then when she after she married him and they had kids, she withdrew from the workplace and took care of the kids, stayed at home. As many women, all the evidence we have suggests that a majority of women want to do that. Now, many can't, perhaps most can't now, but she's going to support policies that make that impossible.
Well, it says, according to this article, her $1 billion is going to be used to identify and fund organizations and policymakers committed to these 3 priorities: dispelling the barriers women face at work, creating opportunities for women to scale to leadership positions, and making sure businesses are held accountable for fostering gender equality.
Oh, God, that means more lawsuits, more grievance politics, and more workshops for everybody.
Well, what is something that you think would be productive with this money?
You know what I would do? Well, first of all,
you had $1 billion, Christina.
If I wanted to do something for the gender inequity or gender problems, maybe something on work-life balance, and also helping young men succeed, because the dearth of young men with the capacity to make a good living in the knowledge-based economy, is just creating this gap, and many women are ending up without husbands, or husbands who can take care of the kids.
You realize what a scolding you're going to get for just saying that the Women's Inequality Fund should help young men.
Of course, the education of young men. But see, she has bought into this idea that it's a zero-sum game, that there's a battle between Venus and Mars, and she's going to give $1 billion to Venus. Give $1 billion to men and women to work out problems. There are areas where young men are behind, and that hurts everyone. That hurts girls and women, their mothers, their sisters, if they're failing. And then there are problems where you can help women there. But it's not.
It would help if it was put towards looking at policies in other countries that have helped women. But when you look at sums like $1 billion, I have a plan. I think you should just hand the money out like Andrew Yang.
It would do more good.
If she would just give us all a big chunk of money, then we wouldn't
fund as scholarships. But what I would do is I would try to find intelligent, humane solutions to the growing homeless problem in Seattle, where she lives.
Yeah.
So
I assume there are some homeless women out there.
Well, it's probably mostly men. So maybe that just doesn't count, because that's the wrong team. She's playing for the women's team.
But as we talked about on a recent show too, the people who are really hurting, it's as you say, it's working class men and working class women who are in industries and jobs that are simply not going to exist, not least because of what the
automation.
World and what the world that Microsoft has brought us of this the tech and digital world.
And if she wanted to,
so all the retail clerks and everybody who are going to be put out of business, that would be super helpful. But it doesn't. I don't know. But it's so vague. The problem with these rich donations is they're incredibly vague. They get hostage to, as you say, certain groups with certain agendas, and they never really seem to be groundbreaking. They just seem to be making the donor feel really, really good.
She feels really good, but
institute that will not do
I think
anything.
This money is going to go towards. It's either mostly it's going to be wasted. It's not going to help anyone.
You know what? We'll find out in 208 years.
Or if there's a billionaire out there who wants to fund the femsplainers, we'll track. Yeah, every cent, and then we'll counteract anything that's good. We'll promote anything that's bad, which is going to be most of it.
Yeah, we could at least meet our costs. And speaking of that, before we bring on our guest, Patreon listeners, thank you. We love you. Thank you for supporting us. And if you like what you're hearing, we're not kidding that we may not be able to continue if we don't get more support.
Yeah.
And
it doesn't have to be $1 billion.
It doesn't. $1 billion would be really
a dollar.
If one of you gives $1 billion, we're made. We're fine, and we'll stop begging. But our minimum, we like $5 a month. But if every person listening right now gave $1 a month, we won't need Melinda Gates. So if you can do that, go to patreon.com/femsplainers and donate $1
Maybe
a month.
We should stage, if people fund us, we can go to Seattle or wherever she is and stage an intervention with Melinda.
We'll look so nutty. I don't want to.
I know we might get arrested.
Yes, I think she has security. Okay, let's talk about, though, now our incredible guest we're bringing on. I really think we can call her legendary.
Yes.
This woman has won 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Press Club. She's written 14 books, including its recently reissued Washington Journal reporting Watergate and Richard Nixon's downfall. And her name is Elizabeth Drew. We are lucky to know her. She's just kind of come into our circle of friends.
Yes, we love her.
But she has been at the front lines of Washington politics since the early 1960s. She's had an incredible career.
Real pioneer as a journalist, a female journalist, when it was a very hostile environment for women. She was there.
She was on the front lines of Nixon's impeachment. So, and she still is a prolific contributor to many prominent publications.
And she knows a lot of secrets.
And she's a great gossip. And we're going to get her on all of these things. So stand by for Elizabeth Drew coming into the studio.
Elizabeth Drew, welcome to the Femsplainers.
Happy to be here.
It's such an honor to have you, and I'm so excited, and I don't know where to begin. With the go to the past and scandals that you've witnessed, front row seat, or do we start with the current madness?
Well, Elizabeth, you've been in Washington a long, long time, so let's just, before we go back a little, let's have a weather reading from you. How bad is it right now compared to what you've seen?
Like Clinton,
Nixon.
Nixon.
This is the worst I've ever seen.
Really?
During Watergate and impeachment, which I followed for what was a journal in the New Yorker and became a book, which I didn't think about. I called it a constitutional crisis. People were going on about, this is a criminal White House and things like that. And I thought they were missing the point because it was a question of were the checks and balances working. That was a patty cake compared to now. We've never had this kind of total White House defiance of the Congress. And the president saying, I'm just not going to play. I don't like it. You're not nice to me. You're mean. And I'm not going to play. And this is very serious. I mean, the impeachment clause was put in the Constitution by the founders for a very important reason, serious reason, which was we want a way to have a check on a president between elections. Maybe we can't wait 4 years if his behavior is such. They picked it up from English law, which they all knew, and there was an impeachment going on in England. And they said we have to be able, the Congress and the people have to be able to hold a president to account. Well, you can't hold him to account if he won't cooperate in the slightest. I mean, when they get to, this would probably be an article of impeachment, as it was against Nixon. But this wholesale defiance, we've never seen before, and it's very dangerous.
Well, without getting into the weeds of the impeachment, because also it's changing day by day, and I want to get to you because I think we're maybe all a little tired about talking about this current president. We'll come back. There was defiance from Nixon in the sense that he refused to hand over the recordings, right? And didn't they have to go to the Supreme Court?
They went to the Supreme Court.
We now have to do that again, maybe?
Well, they had to go to the Supreme Court to get the tapes.
Right.
Nixon had taped everything that went on in the Oval Office, which only he and his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, knew about. And so the investigators, what we had then was a special prosecutor who had much more power than Mr. Mueller had, and now we don't have Mr. Mueller. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the prosecutor, and Nixon turned him over. I mean, they played games about, there was this very elderly, rather hard-of-hearing senator, John Stennis of Mississippi, and they kept calling him Judge. We'll have Judge Stennis listen to the tapes and see if that's all right. That didn't go over so well, but they did cooperate. I think in the end, Nixon was a product of the political system. He'd been in the House, he'd been in the Senate, he'd been vice president for 8 years, he was a lawyer, and he understood there were boundaries, and you had to obey the law up to a point. And Mr. Trump doesn't honor any of that.
Didn't Nixon, though, think that he was just doing what everyone else did? And, Bobby Kennedy had taped people. And
he resented the Kennedys like mad because, they were glamorous and they went to Harvard. He was accepted at Harvard, but his parents were very poor and they couldn't afford to pay. He even got a scholarship. He was a very smart man. But the parents couldn't pay for all the expenses of his going, so he went to Duke instead. So he always resented the Kennedys. First of all, John Kennedy beat him very, very barely in 1960. There are all these myths that they had stolen the election, which they did not. And that he had been on that one, too. He didn't fight it. He said, all right, they checked it out and thought that they couldn't win it even if they won Illinois, so they forget about it. So he yielded rather gracefully. But he resented the Kennedys for the glamour, and he hated the whole idea of Georgetown cocktail parties. And
they always say that. God, every president say, "Well, who's
no,
Georgetown?"
Really.
They don't even exist really anymore.
No,
in the modern day they do. Like Clinton didn't like them, Obama didn't like them, George W. didn't like them,
Jimmy Carter banned them.
Yeah.
No, Clinton went to them. Clinton was social with Georgetown people.
Yeah.
Obama, he didn't have time. None of them have time, but some you make the time. But the Clintons got around.
And also, they don't really exist anymore, and that's something I wanted to ask you about. But let's go back to, as you called her, Little Lizzie Brenner.
Mm-hmm.
I think you said that ironically. I can't
said
ever
Lizzie
imagine.
Brenner. I didn't say little, but I was little.
You said when Lizzie Brenner was growing up in Cincinnati, you didn't want to live your mother's life playing canasta and mahjong. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing, and you kind of, as you put it, you fell into journalism. It was a series of accidents, which I think is how careers used to go for a lot of people back then. I mean, unless you were training to be a doctor or something.
That's right.
This whole sort of career-focused of
so much of
modern
it is just sort of accident and luck.
Right.
Being at the right place at the right time. Although you had a Wellesley education.
Yes,
Wellesley
but that
College.
didn't train you for anything.
Except the MRS degree, as they called it.
Well, yes, when as we were heading towards graduation, my classmates had what I called ring fever. They desperately wanted to get engaged because they didn't know what else to do. Women didn't have many opportunities then. I think in our class, one went to medical school, one went to law school. A number of them went into teaching. That's something that women had been accepted in for a very long time. But mostly, they didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do, but I was not anxious to get engaged.
And this is immediately post-World War II, right? So women had
not
been...
Not that far.
No, but it was like the late 50s. I mean, it was still close. Women had been working through World War II and then came out, and then there was this, as we learn it, great domestic...
This was a very different world than the post-World War II period. It was much later, as sociologically, it was much later.
Although now when you look back, you think, I used to think the Vietnam War was 100 years away from when I was born. And in fact, I was still a small child while it was going on.
I protested it. I was a teenager.
Yeah. But you were in that 50, you grew up in that sort of 50s era.
In the 50s.
Right. And so it was the cult of domesticity, as they called it, and if you didn't have to work as a woman, you didn't, right?
Wellesley had a saying, non ministrari sed ministrari, which we loosely translate as not to be ministers, but ministers' wives. Mm-hmm. And most of us didn't know what we were going to do. As I say, many panicked and got married right away. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do. They sent out recruiters from various places for examples, and there's some lady came who worked for the telephone company, took complaints for the telephone company. She thought it was fascinating, and I must say I wasn't very drawn to it. And I accidentally, because I had a boyfriend at the law school near there, and he knew somebody who was leaving a job as secretary and receptionist for some architects in Cambridge. So that was a good job. And I went to probably the biggest investment in my future I made was I went to secretarial school at night. And I learned to type. I'm a very fast typist. And
You learned shorthand.
speed writing.
Speed writing.
Speed writing.
Oh,
And I sometimes can figure out what I wrote, and I sometimes can't.
Is that like Pittman? It was Pittman's shorthand that my mother, she was a journalist at about the same time. She knew Pittman's shorthand and she
I
taught
don't know
it
whose
to me.
it was, but it's shorthand. And, you know, I still do some of it, but I sometimes have to stare long and hard.
My mom does her grocery list still in Pittman's shorthand. No one can read it except her.
Anyway, so I didn't have a clue what I was going to do, and I worked for these architects, and they were low on business, and so they took turns bringing in their slides and teaching me architecture, which was great fun. But then they couldn't afford me. And so I was walking the streets, and I went into, somebody said, go see Emily Flint at the Atlantic, which was at 8 Arlington Street in Boston, right,
Yeah, I've
facing
been to the
park.
office.
And Emily Flint said, we don't have anything, but there's this thing upstairs that was sort of a mom and pop shop, and they put out a magazine called The Writer. Now, I didn't think about writing, but it was like a trade magazine for freelance writers. Mm-hmm. And I was an editorial assistant, so it made me have a vague relationship with a sentence. Which
So you didn't like practice writing in school? You didn't?
No, I didn't major in English because I didn't want to take writing courses, but that was creative writing, which I still can't do.
What did you major in?
Political science, but by accident, again, I didn't want to major in English, as I said, because I didn't want to take the writing courses, which was creative writing. But I was heavy on history and heavy on English, and just marginally major in political science. But then political science went off the rails. I thought it got very technical and quantitative, and if you can't count it, it didn't happen.
Right.
So that when I launched the subject of money and politics, I said, well, I got really slammed in reviews because the political scientists, somebody said to me, the political scientists are all mad at you. And, you know, it was not invented here, but they said you didn't quantify it. You didn't prove that money bought a bill. I said, I didn't say that. It buys access.
Right.
But they were very harsh.
But this was later. This was much later.
It was later when I was writing for the New Yorker, but I'm just saying the kinds of things that you run into. So then I decided to come to Washington. I had been here as an intern during college, and I noticed the enormous difference between what Ms. Overacker taught us in political science and seeing these human beings interact. It fascinated me. And so I came down without having a clue what I was going to do. And somebody said, you ought to go to Congressional Quarterly. You'll learn a lot about, following Congress. That's what they did, really. And you worked from the documents. You worked from the congressional record. You weren't allowed to go to the Hill until I insisted when we had a civil rights filibuster.
And you couldn't use adjectives.
Couldn't use adjectives. It was all very, very dry. But I just learned a tremendous amount. I was offered a 6-month temporary job, and I ended up staying 5 years and did, almost every job there. And I learned how to read a bill. I can still remember going to the Justice Department. That's when we were liberated and could actually go out on an interview. And I went to the Justice Department during the civil rights fight. And this man kept saying, you must be a lawyer. I said, no, I know how to read a bill. So, you learn things like that.
It's hard to read a bill.
It is hard to read a bill.
And what are they talking about? You have to learn this. It's all in this strange,
right. But then, and you learn how to put it into English and explain it.
Right.
So that was invaluable education for me.
But you talk about, well, then I went to Washington, and I'd been here as an intern. I mean,
yeah, who does that? I mean,
who does that? You're a young woman. You said you didn't have any idea of really what you wanted to do, but you had some drive, clearly, and you were interested in politics and history.
Just to move from Boston to D.C. and then look for.
Yeah, I knew about 3 people when I moved here, but I had been very affected by having been here as an intern and seeing how interesting it was. And, I was getting a little old for the graduate school boyfriends, and the law school guy and I broke up. And so I thought, why don't I go to Washington?
Why do you think? I mean, it just happens that what
no, but you can tell us
to help. Yeah, why did you break up?
I can't remember.
Was he a Harvard man?
Harvard Law School.
Oh my God! Well, anyway, no, it's just amazing to me because you were a pioneer. I mean, women just didn't do that. It was unheard of. Your parents didn't make a fuss?
No, I think they were a little puzzled as to what was going on. I think my mother wanted, but if my mother had had her way, I'd have stayed in Cincinnati and married Johnny Frank, whose family owned something called the Frank Tea and Spice Company. I think they did Skippy peanut butter. And
You could have been the Skippy peanut butter fortune?
Mrs. Skippy. But
I'm with your mom,
I'm with your mom. Come on.
and I'd have, married Johnny Frank. He wasn't interested in me at all, but
It never matters with mothers.
and gone to the country club and done all those things. And I thought I'd be bored silly, but it wasn't a serious option. I just didn't, I wanted to learn. I wanted to see more of the world. Now I was a kind of an independent soul. I mean, while I was at CQ, I had piled up a lot of vacation time, and I took 6 weeks off and went around the world on my own. I just was adventurous.
What year was that, approximately?
Oh, 1959,
Oh, my
60,
God.
something like that.
That was a great time to go around the world.
Mm-hmm. No, early 60s. It was early 60s.
And the dollar went a long way.
And did you have siblings?
I have had. He's passed away. An older brother, 7 years older, though. So
Right.
we were good friends, but we were sort of leading very different lives.
You stayed
at
in
that point.
Cincinnati?
Yeah, for a while, and then
Yeah. All right. So you come here, you get involved in congressional politics, and then you start to become a journalist. You start to become a reporter. Tell us a little bit about that. And the first thing you mentioned, was the civil rights filibuster.
Well, it covered the Civil Rights Bill for CQ.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the long filibuster. This was very exciting stuff, a civil rights bill.
And were you political? Like were you excited? I mean, were you part of the '60s excitement of these big
Well, I
changes
wasn't
going on?
burning my brow or anything like that.
No.
No, I was just very interested.
Yeah.
And I find politics, and I found politics interesting because it's people and how they interact and who is smart about it and who isn't smart about it and how they form alliances or fail to. And this filibuster went on, and I developed a huge crush over a man named Russell Baker, who was covering the Senate for the New York Times, which made him kind of a god. And he kind of looked like Gary Cooper. I mean, he was just lovely.
He was a dreamboat.
He really was. We confessed later that we each had a crush on the other. Much later in life, it was rather sweet. So, and Russ said to me one night I'm name dropping, I don't mean to, but he said to me one night when we were having dinner and waiting for the filibuster, he said, being in Washington is like being in constant graduate school. You keep learning. So you have this issue, you have a trade issue, and I learned about creeping red fescue or something like that. And then you have a civil rights issue, you have a housing issue. You just learn a lot.
You learn a lot. You're constantly studying. I agree. Being a journalist, you're an eternal student because suddenly you have to be an expert on something.
That's right.
And then find out all about it. And then you get to move on to the next thing. But you had a great mind. You had a fine mind, and at an exciting time. And have a fun. But so few women were doing that. That's just the thing. Did you read Betty Friedan? Were you a self-consciously, aspiring feminist?
No.
Why not? I mean, that was also obviously.
Did you know Betty?
That was later. I tell you, I name drop. I did know Gloria Steinem because somebody had said you ought to meet her, and then we were going to this Vienna Youth Festival. It was sort of the commies versus the non-commies in the world. And Gloria, and after that, we stayed friendly. She was in New York, but she had a gentleman here in Washington, and she'd come down to see him. And we often had breakfast. And she said to me one morning, I think I'm going to start a movement. And I said, oh, what's that? And she said, women. And to my everlasting disgrace, I didn't know what she was talking about. I mean, I did, but I didn't.
You didn't, yeah.
And so, no, I was not part of any movement. I just did my thing.
Well, you had said that you had gone into, once you left Congressional Quarterly, I guess you had decided that this is what you wanted to do. You wanted to keep reporting, being part of the center of politics. And the first time you went to apply for a job, you were told we don't hire women.
That's right. And that was at somebody very famous said that. And
you can tell us who it is. We won't tell anyone.
I sort of let him rest in peace.
Okay.
But this was all over the place. Wall Street Journal was starting something called the National Observer, something like that. And again, this man was Alan Otten, a wonderful reporter, nice man. And he said, I'd love to have you do that, but we're not going to hire women.
We got it out of her.
Why didn't it? Why do you think it was? Well, it was just the way things were.
It's the way things
For
were.
politics, because as you know, and you've met, I'm so thrilled that you've met my mom, who was a journalist as well. Not different place and time, but I mean different country, I should say. She was in Australia.
Different continent.
But she felt always that journalism was the one place that really was open to women. But maybe if you stayed within certain lanes,
that's right. In America,
lifestyle,
it was more women could be in magazine writing. You see, because we were hidden, but not daily journalism. It was considered you just weren't to be out there where the men were, where the real reporters were, and so that's why a lot of women, went into magazine writing, and myself included. And so while I was at CQ, I did look around. And then I just started writing magazine pieces for something called The Reporter. It's extinct now. And it was a good magazine, and it had, it was reporting pieces. But I ran into a problem there in that the editor of it, the founder and editor, and he married somebody very rich, Max Askley, he was the first of the neocons. We didn't have the term then. But he was very pro-Vietnam War, and among other things. And I wrote about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was the fraudulent way that we were gotten into that war. So he was not very happy about that. And then I wrote about, something about public housing and what a mess it was. And he said, "You've insulted my friend. He got the name wrong. You are no longer on the staff."
And thus begin your famous firings.
That's right, a whole string of them. No, but that was actually, I started writing for The Reporter while I was at CQ, and then I was offered a job as a writer for it. And then, one thing led to another, and Max fired me. There were other things going on, who hired me, blah, blah, blah. So I was married then to Pat Drew, and he said, "Well, I can support you. Why don't you see what you can do in writing?" And so I called a man named Bob Manning, and he was the editor of The Atlantic. And I had met him here. He'd been the spokesman for the State Department, but it was a very glamorous job, but he was very in. He was a nice man. And he said, "Well, what are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I just got fired by Max Askley." And he said, "Congratulations, he's fired some of the best reporters I know. You want to write for me?" And I said, "Yeah, that's kind of what I called." And he said, "Do you have any ideas?" This was like a Thursday. And I did have an idea because Congress had barred labeling of cigarette packages. The NIH, National Institutes of Health, wanted to have a warning label on cigarettes.
Well, that sounds like communism.
It definitely. And so the cigarette lobby was fighting it like mad, and they managed to defeat it in the Senate. But I knew about that. I had I knew a couple of people working on it. Some of the most informative people in Washington are not famous. Nobody's ever heard of them. They're staff people. This used to be more the case than it is now. They're more buttoned down for whatever reasons. And so you could learn an awful lot from it. You didn't have to meet the senators. You didn't. They were very informative then, and you didn't have to talk to them. And so Bob said to me, "That sounds good. Can you do it by Monday?" This was a Thursday, and I sat down and wrote it. And it was in the Atlantic. It was the easiest piece I ever did. I don't know why. It was just in me, and I could do it. And so then I wrote more for him, and I was on the staff of the Atlantic. They opened up their Washington office for me. I was the first person. They had an office on. They found an office on Connecticut Avenue, and I worked for them for a long time.
And then you moved famously to the New Yorker, where you worked for...
Not right away. I needed to earn more. Mr. Drew died, and I needed to earn more. And one thing led to another, and I was offered a television program.
Right.
And it was amazing. See, I never thought, oh, here's me, and I'm doing a television program. It happened. And it fell into place, and I had a half-hour one-on-one interview program on PBS.
I remember that program.
Do you really?
Yeah.
It ran twice a week, and there were some incidents we can come back to if you want.
I do.
And speaking of the problem of being a woman,
You're doing pretty well for a woman who met first time she applied for a job that they didn't hire women. Is this why you didn't join the Gloria Steinem movement? Because in the end, you were getting recognized for your talent.
I didn't think about it.
Yeah.
I just did my thing.
And by the way, ladies out there, that's kind of how it happens. You just do it. You just did it. And you weren't thinking like, can I do? You just did it. But it's an amazing thing about you that you know, because I'm always fascinated with people who were sort of the first.
How bad it was we started this television program, and I did it for about a year or more than that, year and a half, until then it was transferred over to a guy. His name is Jim Carrion, and Ford Foundation was funding it, and a man named Fred Friendly, and Fred said, call Jim Carrion, and I said, I'm trying to reach him. He won't call me back. Finally, he called me back, and he said, there's a problem with women on the air, and I'm going to take you off. This was 1971. And his idea of how to take me off was he put a guy in as the executive producer whose assignment was to drive me crazy. And he did.
Oh, God.
And I had a wonderful mentor. I think a lot of lives are very affected by if you're lucky enough to have a mentor. And mine was a man named John Gardner, who had written books. He became Lyndon Johnson's, it was called then, Health, Education, and Welfare Department. And I met him because I had an assignment from the Saturday Evening Post to write about him. And they turned the article down because they said, we don't believe there's anybody like that. Because he was a spectacularly interesting and wonderful man. And I had to call him up and tell him that this article hadn't worked. And I started crying, and he said, Elizabeth, he talked very slowly, it's not your fault, it's mine. And we became friends, and he became a very important mentor. Anyway, so I was being driven crazy by this guy at PBS. It wasn't PBS then. And John Gardner said to me, your learning curve is over. You've done these interviews. They've been very good. I made a point of not interviewing someone ex officio, someone who, just because he was important in the Congress, if he wasn't interesting, like Jerry Ford. I never interviewed Jerry Ford, who, of course, later became president. But I'm not sorry I didn't interview him.
Not a lot. He's not a lot of laughs.
No, exactly. Exactly. But I did interesting people, like Buckminster Fuller, the famous architect, and people like that, as well as politicians. Anyway, and John Gardner said to me, your learning curve is over, and I believe your heart is in writing. He read me better than I read myself. And he said, I think you should go back to writing and stop fighting this nonsense. And I thought, well, where am I going to write? And, can I make a living? And I wrote a highly subjunctive letter to William Shawn, the justly legendary editor of The New Yorker.
And the rest is history.
That's right. And what was known about The New Yorker was that they had enough articles to publish for 3 years without buying any more, because that wouldn't...
And without worrying about whether they would be relevant or not.
That's right. And Richard Rovere, who was wonderful in his day, but he was not well. He was writing from Washington. So, but anyway, I sort of thought at most I would get back a letter saying, well, try us with an idea from time to time. That would be, that would have been great. Instead, right back came in this little teeny-weeny type that he used. Dear Mrs. Drew, I'd very much like to talk to you about writing for The New Yorker. Please come see me next time you're in New York. Oh, well. So it happened I was in New York the next week. I was...
It just happened to be...
Well, I was dragooned into judging the National Book Awards, which is something definitely not to do. Because the winner knows they deserved it, and the losers all hate you for the rest of...
For the rest, forever,
yeah. I mean,
yes.
There's somebody who didn't get it, and he never spoke to me again. because somebody ratted and told them how we had all voted. Anyway, I went to see William Shawn, who turned out, I thought I was going to see a tall, severe, and something like the then editor of the Atlantic. Well, he was this little man with these big, wide eyes, pretty bald, little voice, and he was a genius. He was just an incredible person. And he said to me, "I'm very glad you wrote to me, Mrs. Drew. You've been very much on my mind for 3 years." I mean, but he never would have reached out and said, "Hey, kid, come write for us." He just waited. He waits for people to come to him.
Well, how does that make him a great editor? Like, what people, we always hear that he was a great editor.
I'll tell you.
But what makes him great? Yeah.
Well, let me tell you how this book came about, the Washington Journal. When I started, we weren't sure what I was going to do, how I was going to make use of it, because Rovere was still writing from Washington. I did some interview pieces, and I went to see Shawn on Labor Day of 1973. I'm part witch.
Mm-hmm.
And so...
We've heard that said about you.
Yeah, it's true.
Rhymes with... No, okay. Nancy Reagan.
It rhymes with pitch. I'm a good pitcher.
Yes, exactly.
And so he said, "What are you thinking of writing about, Mrs. Drew?" Everybody was Mr. and Mrs. there. It was all very polite, except for Shawn's own contemporaries like Roger Angell and people who were there when he was a young editor coming up. He was a second editor of The New Yorker. And so I said, "I think we're going to change vice presidents and presidents within a year." This was wild. It was not so surprising about vice president because Spiro Agnew was famously in a little bit of legal trouble for just because he was taking money in cash. So I said that. He said, "Oh, really?" And his eyes would widen. And I said, "Well, we certainly can be certain about Agnew, but I think Nixon's in real trouble. All we knew about was the Watergate break-in, and not much had happened." And so we agreed. We talked back and forth, and he said, "Well, how?" I said, "Well, why don't I maybe do a journal where I watch it and I see how he had this." His eyes would widen, and he always got to the point. He said, "That's right. We've never had to change vice presidents, have we? We don't know how to do that, do we?" Which was exactly how to focus on it. Anyway, so we started, and he would call up on Saturdays. And he called me one Saturday and said, "How's it going, Mrs. Drew?" And I said, "Mr. Shawn, I'm thinking about doing something I've never done, which is put myself in it a little bit more. As this is my observation, and I went here, and here's how I reacted." And he said to me, "Take a chance on anything, Mrs. Drew." Can you imagine?
God, what an editor.
And that's what was great about him. And you know that at the other end is somebody with perfect taste. He's not going to let you fall on your face or make a fool of yourself. And he would... If he didn't like something or didn't think it was appropriate, he'd just draw a line through it. We didn't discuss it. That was all. He liberated me. I wrote as well then, or better then, than just some things I do now.
But he saw who you were, and he saw your talent, and he let you soar.
Well, he really did. And he edited me through that. He edited me for many years.
So I want to know about that. What was it like to be edited by...
It was glorious.
Oh.
It was the Elysian Fields.
Oh.
Because nothing was ever, you can't say that. Oh, one of the things, one of my first interview I did with somebody, and I said, "So-and-so has played a central role in something." And they said, "Central is not a New Yorker word, Mrs. Drew." And so you just never used it again. He was very, very attached to language and had very, very high standards. But here's the other thing that was terribly important. He said to me, using the royal we sort of, but there was nothing self-important about him in the slightest. He was this little shy man. And he said, "We tell our editors we don't improve pieces." Meaning, they don't rewrite, they don't second guess. And I had a lot of problems with that later. People who, they think they know more and they don't, and impose things on your writing. But if they had a question, it was all suggestions in the margins, like, "Would you like to move this up?
Right.
Don't you think there should be a comma here?" This kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so you could just, a name drop. I ran into John Updike at an event here. Somebody wanted me to go to. It was a book event. And I started talking to him. I said, Sean made me better than I ever thought I could be. He said, me too. This is what he did. He helped you grow. And I can remember we were down there and editing, which is what I did with the journal was, or what he did with the journal is, we would do seasons. And there would be like 3 pieces for fall, spring, fall, winter, spring, summer. And we were down there like 2 a.m. going through these galleys. And, excuse me, discussing the meaning of the Fourth Amendment, which had to do with your home is your castle, and this had to do with not just the Watergate break-in. That wasn't the main thing, but we can get to that. That wasn't. Nixon and I both felt that there was something else that was more important than that. Anyway, so he just grew you, and he had your back, and he had perfect taste. And he loved writers. He loved writing. We all told him our troubles, and he would get into it. He was just a wonderful man, but also just a great, great editor. I was with the New Yorker for 17 years.
Yeah. And then that's when Tina Brown
took
editor.
over and fired me.
Right.
And that was quite interesting because I didn't know that was coming. And she had been advised against it.
Yeah.
It turns out I was shocked to find out that the New Yorker actually did polling of their readers. I was shocked. That struck me as a very un-Shawnian thing to do. Because he thought, I'll just put out the best magazine I can and people will come to it and read it or not. That's all I can do. But they did, and it turned out that Pauline Kael and I were the most read people.
Now, did you know Pauline?
I met her from time to time, yeah. But people didn't hang around there all that much. Or if I was in New York, you're in your little office, somebody's office, and just working.
Did you work at home a lot?
Yes, I worked at home. I wrote at home. And we didn't have the internet then.
I know. I think back, like, how did that work? You'd finish something, and then how did you get it?
What it used to be is, like, for the Atlantic, we didn't have the terrorism threat then. And so I'd go to the airport and find somebody and say, would you please take this to Boston?
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And
that's wonderful.
And then we were about the last place to get the internet because Sean worried that if we all had it, nobody'd come to the office ever. So we finally got it, but it never worked. I mean, I couldn't make it get up there. And so we'd go on the phone, galley by galley, galley 14, 4th line down, 3 words from the right, please insert blah, blah, blah. This could take a lot of time.
I know, but you look back at the writing of that era, and it was so much better than much of what we have today. So somehow it worked. People were able to edit and make changes and have beautiful...
Well, some people were able to edit. I mean, during this period before I went to the New Yorker, I was sort of freelancing, and I sold a piece to Harper's, which was a hot magazine at the time. A person named Willie Morris edited it. And he gave it to an editor, and she put it through her typewriter. Remember typewriters? And
I do. I wrote my dissertation on a typewriter.
Yeah.
By then, it was very advanced IBM Selectric.
There you are. That was very sexy.
Yeah.
And she just put it through her typewriter and put in her own wording and language. And I could have used being in Harper's at that point, but it's never been a dilemma for me. I just went to Willie and I said, "I'm sorry, I can't have this. And my name's on it, and it's not how I would write, so I'm withdrawing it." And he said, "Okay," but I've always been that way. I mean, it's I think Sean spoiled us, but he was so right to let people have their own voice and do not impose, what you think about something.
Well, let's go back now to Washington then and now. So we had your initial weather taking, and you said it's terrible now. Tell us a little bit about then. You said you promised you'd have a story of Teddy Kennedy, but
wait, I want to hear the Kennedy story.
Okay, and then that world of the politics and how it sort of the social life around the politics in Washington then and how you feel it plays out.
But the Teddy Kennedy story, which apparently
I told this to a man named David Frum. You've heard of him?
Vaguely. I think he's been on the show, hasn't he?
I think you've met.
Yeah.
Is he an incel? No.
No, he's a very famous writer and thinker. And a very nice man.
Very
by
nice
the way.
man.
He's one of my heroes. In any event, I told him the story, and he was so stunned by it because people have their own idea of Kennedy and Chappaquiddick and Kennedy liberal and all these things, Playboy. Well, I had a pretty serious back problem for a while, and I was abed for months. And I knew Kennedy some, but I got to know him better when I wrote a two-part series for The New Yorker, which became a book called Senator, his closest friend, Senator John Culver. And Culver told him about my plight of just being abed for, all these months. And I had remarried by then. And I got a call saying Senator Kennedy would like to come over for dinner. Hello? And I said, well, it has to be if that's fine, in the bed. He came, and he sat in this little, plastic chair in this small bedroom, eating off a tray. And it was just incredibly entertaining and fun. And then the next day, he sent me flowers and thanked me. His mother really raised him very well. He was always sending notes and flowers. I had major surgery one time. The first flowers that came were from Ted Kennedy. They came, from on a motorcycle. And he was a very thoughtful, sweet man.
That is the most innocent story of Ted Kennedy being alone in a bedroom with a woman that I have ever heard.
My husband also, I couldn't move, so I was...
Well, that makes it easier.
I would not have been very satisfied.
Was he dashing in his younger years? Was he...
Dashing? I don't really use the word dashing, but he was... he worked very hard. He was one of the hardest working senators I've ever seen.
And what about John F. Kennedy? Did you interview him? Or?
No. I mean, I had seen him enough, actually, when I was an intern, and somehow he remembered. So when I'd see him, he would, nod. And I had known Ted Sorensen, who was his speechwriter.
Right.
And in fact, when I was looking around for what to do in Washington when I, came down, I went to see him because we were getting into the 1960 election. I'm very old. And Ted Sorensen, I said I might be interested in working on the campaign. He said, I'm the campaign, and we're not really started yet. He said, what would you do in the meantime? And I said, well, I have an offer, 6 weeks, 6 months, something, temporary offer from Congressional Quarterly. He said, take it, because you'll learn a lot, and then come back to me.
Oh, it was smart.
And I never did. I stayed at CQ. I told him later what an incredible influence he had on me.
Yeah.
But JFK, it was just sort of a nodding thing. And I knew Bobby, especially when he was Attorney General and I was covering civil rights and all of that. And I didn't know him well, but I knew him. And I knew him when he was a senator. I don't mean to be name-dropping here, but you asked me. And then I knew Ted, mainly through Culver, but then I knew him. I'll tell you, when I was writing about Culver, he was managing the Endangered Species Act. Remember that? It's one of the many laws that...
Did Nixon? Did that originate with the Nixon administration?
No. I'm trying to... Who was president then? Anyway, I can't remember. But Trump just ended it.
Oh, God.
Trump's ended a lot of environmental...
So John Culver was managing the bill on extending the Endangered Species Act. So I learned about snail darters and things, all these obscure things. And he was making a speech one day, and I was called Liz in those days. And I was in the gallery watching his speech, and I began to get notes from the Senate floor. Gaylord Nelson, who was Culver's very good friend, Liz, please leave the gallery so Culver will shut up. So I got about 3 of these. McGovern sent one, and I can't remember, Gaylord sent one. But in those days, senators socialized with each other much more.
Yes.
They socialized across the aisle. I've mentioned Gaylord Nelson, who was a major environmentalist, a very funny, good guy from Wisconsin. And he and his wife, Carrie Lee, entertained a lot, very casually. And I went over there one time with Culver while I was writing about him, and there were Republican senators there. Mm-hmm. And Kennedy invited me to a dinner one time, and it was with Stevens of Alaska. And they had made a bet over who was going to win something or other, and one was going to provide lobsters if Boston won, or Massachusetts won, and salmon if Alaska won. Well, and it was a salmon dinner. at Kennedy's house. But, there he was with a Republican, and it was a very mixed group, and it was all very, a major difference was they weren't so busy raising money all the time then. That's really made a huge...
Well, you were one of the original people to draw the influence of money on politics. Yeah.
I smelled it.
Yeah. Because that's what keeps them away now. They're spending all their time fundraising.
That's right.
They don't have time to have dinner with anyone, or they're in their constituency.
Well, they do sometimes during the week, but they're not here weekends.
Right.
Or they go over to another building because they're not allowed to make those fundraising calls from their offices. But I just smelled it. This is, again, the witch in me.
You haven't quite explained that.
Well, that I saw that Nixon was going to go.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay.
And she's not name-dropping, but I have heard mention of your encounters with Elizabeth Taylor, Paul Newman, Robert Redford.
That's the Hollywood side. But was that from your television show?
No.
Because Hollywood and D.C. have a fascinating...
That's right.
Romance or attraction
symbiosis
with each other. Not symbiotic.
Dysfunctional relationship.
Dysfunctional.
No,
because
it's not dysfunctional.
Hollywood wants to be part of it, but never...
Well, there's another part of it. This is name-dropping, but these things did happen. I was invited to a dinner for someone in New York, and it was Jane Pauley, who was leaving the Today Show or starting something, I can't remember. And I was seated next to Robert Redford, or Bob. I was with the
That's what I call him, Bob Redford.
That's right. And I was writing for the Atlantic then, and what I realized is they want us to take them seriously.
Yes.
They want us to feel that they have a mind and that they care. Both were true in his case. Paul Newman, it was a little bizarre. I was at dinner at a friend of theirs of the Newmans from Connecticut, a woman who had moved down here. And she was a good friend of theirs. And Paul Newman and I ended up crawling around under the dining table looking for a contact lens that I had lost.
Wait, you were in a bedroom with Ted Kennedy and under a dining room table with Paul Newman?
I can handle Ted Kennedy,
happened?
Robert Redford, but under a table with Paul Newman? I'm fainting.
Seriously.
This is a problem, Elizabeth. Maybe not so much with Teddy Kennedy, but Paul Newman, that's a problem.
No, I mean, I met Arnold Schwarzenegger a few times because I was doing this Meet the Press a lot on Sundays. I had a contract to be on Meet the Press a lot. And Maria Shriver was doing the Sunday Today show from the Washington Bureau. And I remember the interns came running out and said, Arnold here, he's not as tall as Tim, meaning Tim Russert. He's a blocky guy, big muscle, but he's not very tall. Anyway, and then I'd meet Arnold from time to time, and somebody at a party for Maria or something like that, and he came over to me and he said, so what do you think about the Panama Canal? I thought, damn it, come on.
Can't he at least be harassing me?
Flirtatious? A little flirtatious.
Stop taking me seriously.
Panama Canal. Yeah, that's. But so moving to that, because we also hear stories of Washington in that time. Yeah, of like Teddy Kennedy getting drunk and having sex under restaurant tables. I mean, there does seem to have been...
Well, there were different sides to him, obviously.
No, but a big change from decorum from the Me Too Now Washington versus, back then where there was a lot of, I think, sex going on with and intermingling and
I don't know.
Alcohol.
I really don't know about
She doesn't know a thing about it. Move on.
But, okay, but with Hollywood, because Hollywood now under Trump is completely vanished. There was a point where the White House Correspondents' Dinner, I mean, actual journalists from D.C. couldn't go because it was now being swarmed by Hollywood people under Obama.
Well, that has faded out, though. I mean, the dinner sort of become pointless, but that's a different subject. I want to tell you Elizabeth Taylor's story.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was at a dinner at the Israeli embassy, and she was married then to John Warner, Republican senator from Virginia, and they were there. And
That was the one point where they actually, Hollywood and DC, consummated their relationship in a glamorous way.
that's right.
A brief moment with
And
Taylor.
so we were, it was a fairly largish round table. And I got up to go to the loo, the bathroom, and so did Elizabeth Taylor. And she's walking in with me, and I'm here to tell you she didn't have great legs.
Well, she was a little, let us say,
But she was very nice, really nice.
But wasn't she, according to
Zoftig.
Joan Rivers, she was Zoftig at the time.
Yeah, well, just look at a movie. I mean, you can see it.
Yeah.
In any event, so we got into the bathroom, which had, various stalls. She said, "You know what you are?" And I thought, "Oh, God, what have I done?" And she said, "You're one smart broad."
And you said, "God damn it, stop taking me seriously."
No.
Tip.
No, I will tell you at that point, I would just think, okay,
Yeah.
I don't need to prove myself anymore. That I think she was very nice.
All right. Well, let's talk about now what we began with the impeachment. I mean, you have written this famous book about the Nixon impeachment. Looks like we're going through something again. You talked a little bit about the stonewalling, but let's talk a little bit about the complete changed news culture. This presidency versus Nixon's. I'm sorry, we don't have to go that big, but just how does it feel different between then and now?
First of all, during the Nixon period, there was no internet. There was no cable.
Yeah.
We had a morning paper, an evening paper. Remember evening newspapers? That was Washington Star. We had radio during the day, and then everybody would gather around at 6:30 or 7 to watch the nightly news. That was it. So it was all sort of by tom-toms, And you'd be in a meeting or an interview with somebody, and somebody burst in and said, "Guess what? There's a tape missing," or "Guess what? There's half an hour missing." And it was by telephone, by cross-pollination at restaurants. Somebody said, "Do you wish you'd had cable?" I said, "No, absolutely not, because there's so much that comes rushing at us now." Then it felt like a lot was rushing at us, but we had no idea what it would feel like now. So you have all this stuff, a lot of it unfiltered. And, then you have a president, obviously a president didn't have Twitter. And I don't think...
Even if they did, like
Nixon
Obama,
on
they didn't
Twitter.
use
Nixon,
it the
I don't
way-
think Nixon would have.
No, I don't think so either.
anybody will maybe do it again this way.
And it was very frightening. When I was there, when the House Judiciary Committee took its first vote to impeach Nixon, Article 1, and the room was dead quiet. We'd never done this. I mean, Andrew Johnson had been impeached. Right. That was a while before. So we were very unfamiliar with it, and it was frightening. What are you doing? And it was then bipartisan. You can't have that now. It's not just that it's a different Republican Party. It's just the politics are entirely different. And as somebody pointed out to me a little while ago, and I hadn't thought of it, with the Democrats picking up 40 seats in the House in the 2018 midterms, that meant where they won were districts that could swing, so that they tended to beat the more moderate Republicans, which has moved the House even further to the right. So it's more tribal now and more savage than it was then. But getting back to that night, it was about 6 o'clock at night or 5:30 when they started taking the roll call for impeachment. And we knew it could lead to his being evicted from office. And it was just a monumental thing. Everybody took it very, very seriously. You had a really excellent committee chair in those days. His name was Peter Rodino.
Oh, remember? Yeah.
He was from New Jersey, and of course the Nixon White House spread it about. He was from New Jersey. He's mobbed up, but he wasn't. And he picked a wonderful counsel, which is also very important. A man who had worked for, his name was John Doerr, had worked for Eisenhower's and Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department, and he worked on civil rights. He was a hero, and he was very sound and very careful.
The current president of AEI is his son.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. And they took it very seriously and respectfully and truly Rodino always behaved as this was born in sorrow. I really don't like to do this, but we have to do it. Whereas opposed to Jerry Nadler, the current chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he should be impeached. No, you don't say that.
Yeah.
You don't do that. He talks.
Today, I was watching what I could on television and the Nixon thing, and it just, there was something more somber and serious.
That's right.
And today, I mean, it's interesting, but who knows where it's going to go because there's just so much going on and so much showboating.
Going.
And
I mean,
I think it's going.
Indulge in speculation here, but he's very likely to be impeached. And
I think the Republicans are going to finally just reach
I don't
their.
think we should. Well, I had never bought that the Republicans, the Senate Republicans, would never vote against Trump, and I think I might be proven right. I don't know. There might not be enough to, but it's moving very quickly.
It's starting to happen.
Right.
You can see public opinion moving.
But you find it now much more hot-headed, much more tribal.
Right.
And partly, I'm sure that's because of Twitter and social media that we're reacting much more quickly than we did.
It's also the nature of the parties has changed.
The parties, the news
but maybe
cycle.
they've been formed. I mean, as you said, you could have William Shawn could still have an article for 3 years and still use it.
Not a public affairs article.
Well, but that idea that everything is just happening so much more quickly and intensely.
With all these outlets, you have all this flurry of stuff coming, and look at how many stories have had to be changed or people had to withdraw their tweets. It was just a lot of unfiltered stuff, like confetti coming at us every day. And it was. We thought we were being, you'll see in the book where I say several times, events are coming at us in profusion and it's confusing and all that, but it was nothing compared to now. And it's, as I say, it's so much unfiltered stuff is happening. So and I think we kind of laughed at Nixon, but we were scared of him. And we knew that they were wiretapping private citizens. I mean, you'd get on the phone and say, well, I wonder if the tapper is on the phone. I remember a car just parked outside of my house for about 36 hours. And there was a journalist who lived up the street from me, and he went down to see what was going on. So you didn't feel safe in that sense. I don't think we have that feeling now.
Well, you get death threats like some of our reporters, online.
That is definitely true. But I'm talking about the White House itself.
Yes.
I mean, Nixon had people wiretap, their taxes audited. Trump hasn't figured that out quite yet. So it was more alarming then. And Nixon was smart.
Yeah.
And we
Nixon
laughed at him a lot, but he was very awkward. Really.
Did you feel sorry for him? Ever? No.
No, he made his bed.
Yeah.
What I loved, there was my favorite article of impeachment in that time was Article 2. And it was, which I still think these people ought to adopt, but I don't think they will. I wrote about it in the New York Times, which is abuse of power. And I think if Trump isn't called on abuse of power, then you're sort of saying it's all right to make money off the government. It's all right to do all sorts of things that you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
So it's just a different feel, and Trump is more enraging kind of day by day because, I mean, look at what he's done in the last couple of weeks. And so this has lost him a lot of support among Republicans. So it's a different situation. And it's scary in its own way because you just don't know what he's going to do the next day.
Right. And the world feels more destabilized.
Right.
Last question for you, because I know we're short on time. So given this, I mean, you've seen this sweep of change in both D.C. politics and media. What would you advise the young journalist who is out there now having to cover what looks like another impeachment? What would you advise?
Well, I think it's not just impeachment in general. You're talking about the young journalist who's coming to Washington to cover it. I always tell them, listen very carefully to what they say. You can pick up all sorts of things that way. I certainly did that with my interviewing. There's I'm a movie star. There's a scene of me and all the president's men.
Oh, you're in that?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
With
And you look darling. Your
my
hair.
soigné blonde hair, yes. It was just adorable. But I listened carefully to what they said. And you can't practice it. You can't prepare the question. You just have to listen. The other thing is to say, why is this person telling me this? You know, what's in it for him or her? Mm-hmm. It's just a way of listening carefully and thinking of the implications, following up, doing your homework. I mean, it's kind of unglamorous stuff, but it's the way you could get across.
Which, despite the easiness of research comparatively, as you say, with the internet to look up stuff and things, but we're also living in the era of the canned soundbite, the rehearsed answer. I mean, obviously they rehearsed their answers back then, but I feel it's like harder to penetrate people in that way because...
Well, you just keep after them.
Yeah.
You know, a while ago there was this famous interview that Chuck Todd, the anchor of Meet the Press, had with Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. And Ron Johnson, Republican, had said that he winced when he heard about the president's conversation with the president of Ukraine, where he, in effect, shook him down. And Chuck wanted him to say that again on the air that Sunday, but clearly Ron Johnson had talked to the White House, and the White House puts out the talking points. Wow. You know this. Mm-hmm. But what you have to do is get them past the talking points. But it ended up with Chuck and Ron Johnson, you know, yelling at each other. But you just have to penetrate, so you didn't answer my question. Mm-hmm. I had a famous, well, it was famous at the time, blow up. The second guest I had on my PBS interview was Edmund Muskie, who was a senator from Maine, and he'd run as vice president before. And there'd been a midterm, and Ed Muskie had sat in front of the fireplace looking all like Abraham Lincoln in a wing chair and calming the country down. And Nixon was jumping up and down in his car and, you know, yelling law and order and all that. And it was pretty clear that Muskie was going to run again. And actually, I had talked to my mentor, John Gardner, about doing this interview program. And he said, ask any of them. If they were president, what are the first three things they would do? What do they think are the most important things to do? So Muskie came in, and we're all thinking Abe Lincoln, this tall, calm man, and he sat down. And so I asked him that, and he turned on me, and he said, I'm not going to announce I'm running for president. And, of course, one of the things I decided on, people waste an awful lot of time on Sunday shows saying, are you going to run? Because they're not going to announce it on the Sunday show. And, you can't get me to announce it. He was, it was very scary. And I said, well, Senator, I didn't ask you that. I asked you
if you were.
You were.
What would you advise? All right. And, of course, the show ran twice a week. And it went all over town. Oh, you got to see this. And, I just stayed calm. But it was a sort of frightening moment.
So you went viral before there was viral.
That's right.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Thank you for making the journey here. And
thank you for having me.
And we will look forward to more commentary from you on this circus that we're all living through.
I say it's more than a circus. It's a very scary situation. Our system of check and balance is going to work.
Yeah.
We don't know now.
We don't know.
Right.
I'm just astonished by her because she just did it. Mm-hmm. There she was. Like, she described that moment where she was with Gloria Steinem. There she was. And Gloria Steinem was creating a movement, and that's important. But there's an invisible army of people who weren't part of a movement. They just did it. She didn't even, and it was as she said, it wasn't a plan, except that there was this vital intellect, this curious mind. There was Elizabeth Drew, and she just kept going.
Right. She once said to me, people thought I had this whole plot worked out for Nixon. I didn't. We just followed it. And that's life, and I think we get so caught up these days with going to the right school, getting the right training. And I love how her education was very happenstance, that the sort of very boring job she did for Congressional Quarterly ended up being, No,
but she was learning.
Exactly.
And she did have a fine mind. So she was, a very quick study.
Right.
So she would learn to take speed writing. And, she would learn that. And then she would learn how to be a reporter.
Right.
And then she was curious. But there was another story that comes through that's always been very touching to me. And I remember the first time I heard about this, I think it was Emily Bronte, had written Wuthering Heights, and she was going to a publisher but was hiding her name. And then he realized she was a woman, and then he just said, oh, okay. And that consciousness that can be flexible. So she had these mentors. She had John Gardner.
Interestingly, they were all men.
No, but men, it's something men and women do together. But the women have to kind of push, but then the men have to see the justice of it. So there's William Shawn, and he sees this vital intelligence. And instead of saying no, and he didn't seek her out, but once she wrote him a letter, he said yes. Yeah. And that's an important part of the evolution of freedom.
Well, I think that's why she didn't. I think a lot of women journalists didn't necessarily cotton on to the movement, as it were.
Right.
Because to be a journalist is to be a kind of iconoclast and independent person. Right. And you don't join movements, you cover movements.
And unfortunately, that's changed today. There are a lot of people that went into journalism because they are movement people.
Right. And she was just, as she said, she is not just curious, but she's sort of the ultimate observer.
Yeah.
And that's what I think ultimately makes the best kind of journalist, is you're never inserting yourself into the story.
And she had an open mind.
Trying to listen.
She would listen to people. Yeah. And to this day, she has an open mind.
After all that, we didn't ask her about what she had described as atmospheric discrimination, which was the thing that she kind of, when she recently or earlier this year got this award at the Women's Press Club, she kind of lit in about discrimination. And it was not about Me Too. It was not, as she's now told us. She can be under tables with movie stars and nothing
Paul
happens.
Newman. I would be willing to be Me Too'd by Paul Newman.
but she talked about the real challenge is what she called atmospheric, which is the condescension, the patronizing, I guess, which she got at the start of her career too. We don't hire women. Because she said in this speech that, we're working on equal pay, we're working on equality within childcare and all the other issues, but that intangible quality that keeps women not being taken seriously, not having their ideas listened to, that was the thing. The thing that
but they were both.
But
I think
convey.
There were also the John Gardners, the Wallace Shawns, and in my life, this is my father who believed as much in women's education as men's, and my late husband. There are just these good men who acknowledge the complete justice of women being able to do anything a man can do.
And encouraging. Well, anyway, that was great. As this impeachment unfolds, we should definitely have Elizabeth back to give us her inside the Washington Zoo view of what's going on behind the scenes. But anyway, well, I think that's it. We went long, so I don't think we have time for listener reaction. The next podcast, you're going to be hearing us in Nashville from the stage. We're going to record with E. Jean Carroll, which I'm really excited about.
And we're going to have a Femsplainer karaoke.
Well, we don't know.
We promise we won't do that.
We don't know.
We will not do that.
Patsy Cline?
Yeah.
Maybe. All right. And so we'll look forward to saying hi to y'all from Nashville.
See you later.
Goodbye. Hey, thanks for listening to the Femsplainers. Keep up with us on Twitter and Facebook at Femsplainers and on Instagram at Femsplainers Podcast. Send questions and comments to contact@femsplainers.com.
A big thanks to Ella Ryder, our research and in-studio production assistant, and to Nat Frum, our audio and video editor. And we're proud to be part of the Ricochet Network and grateful to the American Enterprise Institute for allowing us to record in its studio every week in downtown Washington, D.C.
And miss something? You'll find everything you need at our homepage, femsplainers.com, including links to past episodes, our sponsors, where you can sign up to support us, and even to merch. And please don't forget to like us or give us 5 stars on iTunes.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.